something I really have been wanting to ask you about. You make this the statement that Polanyi's approach helped you at least make sense of presuppositionalism,
Mm.
and that the presuppositions are like tools,
Mhm.
and it helps us in servant thinking. Can you help flesh that out a little bit more? How does Polanyi help us make sense of presuppositions?
Oh,
And
that's good, and it was so key for me.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life with experts in those fields. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. On today's very special episode, I have with me Dr. Esther Lightcap Meek, and we're going to be talking about some of her work, including Contact with Reality and Loving to Know, which is her take on her work on a covenantal epistemology following the work of Michael Polanyi. I'll let her pronounce that for us. But Michael Polanyi is this awesome thinker who is usually known for tacit knowledge, but also has a lot to say about realism and our contact with reality. So I'm really excited to jump in on that. Before we get going here, I want to thank everyone over on Patreon for making this podcast possible. You guys are so awesome and growing, and there's more of you that continue to become patrons. I really appreciate the community that's happening over there. If you like this podcast and you want to support it, you want to see me continue to do this stuff, then please consider becoming a Patreon patron. Another way that you can support the podcast is to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give me a like, subscribe, smash the like button, turn on the notification bell, all that good stuff. If you like the podcast, please like the podcast. Please let me know and help me stick around. So without further ado, let's jump in on Michael Polanyi and Tacit Knowledge and Realism and Covenantal Epistemology with Dr. Esther Meek. Dr. Meek, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, it's great to get to know you, Parker, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, definitely. I think I first came upon your work reading John Frame's Festschrift, and you had an essay in there on servant thinking. And I think you probably introduced me to Michael Polanyi. One more time, actually, can you just say it for us? Yeah.
You're doing fine. What you need is confidence.
Okay.
So Polanyi, I tend to say Polanyi.
Okay.
There are other Polanyi that say Polanyi too. So
Okay.
that's what
Perfect.
my default.
Yeah. Well,
So anyway, me a question besides how to pronounce his name. I can't remember.
Oh, not yet. But I was before we jump in on your work and Polanyi, I was interested in finding out like how'd you get into philosophy and theology yourself, and then maybe like how'd you come to focus on epistemology?
Oh, well, that can all be answered in one little story, which is kind of the story of my life. But I seem to have been born a skeptic. So even though I was born into a Bible-believing home and still am Bible-believing, I had questions that, at age 13, I thought were sin. But later came to decide they were epistemological once I found out what they were, because they were, how do I know God exists? And then also, how do I know there's a world outside my mind? So I was, you mentioned contact with reality. It's all about my it's like my whole story has been about my getting over my skepticism with regard to what was beyond me. Like, as if it's really so arrogant to think, that it's only what's in your head that's real. But on me, welcome to modernity.
That's right.
14-year-old infection.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was age 13. When I was in high school, I read Francis Schaeffer's The God Who Is There, and that was when I started to get the idea of what philosophy was.
Okay.
And then I didn't know you could study it. So when I found that out, which was between my freshman and sophomore year, it took me 12 hours to change my entire course of, unfolding my studies, to change majors to study with this man whose reputation I was hearing about, who was a philosopher. And it seemed obvious to me that that's what I had to do. And it also seemed obvious to me that I was not smart enough, but
Hmm.
I was morally obligated because
Hmm.
these were the most important things. I had to do it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you don't believe in a world outside your head, what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
That's like the main question.
Right. Well, it's funny that the moral obligation was there so early on, because that is something that you develop in your covenantal epistemology. That
Yeah.
we have duties to know certain things, and we have duties to think God's thoughts after Him. So how'd you come to study with John Frame then?
Well, that philosopher whose reputation I was getting sung the praises of by his student, he was teaching at Cedarville College, but he was also completing graduate work at Westminster Seminary.
Hmm.
So all my undergraduate history of philosophy that I had with him came with a Van Tillian
Okay.
flavor. And so after that degree, I got a master's in humanities, like an interdisciplinary studies, which I also loved from reading Francis Schaeffer.
Hmm.
And then I, you know, was trying to decide whether to go on in philosophy or theology. And I actually wrote, I mean, back in the day when you wrote letters to John Frame and asked his recommendation. And well, obviously, he recommended that I do theology first and come study with him.
Yep.
So I wanted to get a little more from the horse's mouth because I was not raised in a reformational tradition,
Hmm.
but what I was hearing made very deep sense of what well, even a deeper sense than what I knew. I had been in a dispensationalist framework, which I knew pretty well.
Yeah.
But this kind of larger grasp, profounder grasp of the great truths of Scripture,
Hmm.
and that there would be an integration between those and philosophical claims. That's what I pursued, and as I got into the Van Tillian flow, for Van Til, you can hardly separate theology, apologetics, and epistemology. They're just like one thing.
Right.
And so I guess I inhaled that. And I've never really thought of myself as doing theology,
Hmm.
being in a conservative, having been in conservative religious forms. Women are not supposed to open their mouths. That was
Hmm.
my sense. So, but certainly we're all allowed to be philosophers. So, um,
That's
and
fantastic.
we can't help ourselves.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as you know, and I honor you for having read those books,
Hmm.
Loving to Know and Contact with Reality. There's these rich themes in Scripture. I don't think of myself as doing theology, but to tap a profound idea like the ultimate interpersonhood of the universe, it's like,
Hmm.
why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah.
So I don't think I ever leave philosophy to become theological.
Hmm. Okay.
I don't know the terms well enough, I guess, to be sure, but I feel like I cull themes that I know to be true to Scripture and absolutely profound
Hmm.
to creatively. I think I'm a creative philosopher to use them as motifs in my own work.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I really like in Loving to Know, you take up various other thinkers, and then you say like a conversation with Mike Williams, but then you weave it in. You reveal their philosophy and what they're getting at, and then you weave it into your whole project, which is a covenantal epistemology, which is awesome. It's so cool. It's a way to honor them and expose them. Some of these guys I hadn't heard of at all, but now I'm more interested in them because I see how you're using their philosophy to bring us deeper in and closer up. Um,
You're making me so happy. Thank you so much for saying that.
yeah, definitely, definitely. I'm a fan. I'm particularly interested in Polanyi. Um, because he's such a fascinating figure, and he's onto such cool stuff at such a cool time in philosophy that he was kind of like a rebel, kind of a bad boy, the
Wow.
way I think of him. How how'd you get interested in him? How'd you like discover him and his work?
Well, I got to dissertation stage, and this was at Temple in Philadelphia, which was my home.
Mm.
And by that point, I was in a Presbyterian church, and some young man at church who I believe had heard about Michael Polanyi, having this young man had heard about him when the young man visited L'Abri. So
Oh,
he
wow.
may have heard it from Francis Schaeffer.
Huh.
And I know from other Francis Schaeffer types that Schaeffer was aware of Polanyi's work. So
Mhm.
anyway, this young man let me borrow his copy of Personal Knowledge, and I was looking for a dissertation topic that would allow me to be as broad as possible, because I figured that my calling, if I had one, was to help people who had never had philosophy get their feet wet, especially if they were believers, you know?
Mhm.
And so I always thought and always wanted to be general. I never wanted to get specific.
Mm.
And then I loved how when you looked at the secondary interaction with Polanyi's work, it was from every field. It
Huh.
was so interdisciplinary. And but that actually is one of several reasons why he's not that well known, because it's not as if you include Polanyi in a corpus in, say, economics as over against philosophy, as over against science.
Right.
So he, in that way, he has a bit fallen through the cracks. Another is, you're right, he was challenging the whole framework of philosophy even to this day.
Mhm.
You know, so he was easily dismissed as crazy. And then the other is, he had this way, because he was so brilliant, of not standing on ceremony with regard to credentials, but walking into another field and coming up
Right.
with great ideas and putting them forth, you know,
Yeah.
which doesn't exactly endear you in the field, you know?
Playing in someone else's sandbox and telling them what to do.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so he's so interesting because I believe he started as a scientist and then kind of moved into like philosophy of science type stuff, but then turned economist and then turned just pure epistemology and epistemologist. Does that sound right?
Sorta, pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, he was a brilliant premier scientific discoverer in
Mhm.
conversation with Einstein and everybody else at the
Yeah.
beginning of the 20th century, and in a hugely he was in physical chemistry, and he's credited with over 30 discoveries,
Wow.
and they say if he had stayed in science, he would have gotten the Nobel Prize. But he left it to do philosophy to save science. But his son got a Nobel Prize, as did other people from his lab, which
Wow.
is significant. So not every lab in the world is so concentrated with creative expert excellence that you would have multiple Nobel Prize winners, but his did.
That's
Which
amazing.
again, does that's not exactly a kind of a plebeian, everybody could make a discovery sort of an approach to science, you know?
Right. Yeah.
It tends to be elitist,
Yeah.
you know? Which,
Yeah.
you know, there's a whole bunch of other people that doesn't fly for, you know?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but then he, because he was of Jewish heritage and a Hungarian, uh, he was chased out of one country after another
Mm.
in some ways, and so he left uh, Germany just you know, under cover of darkness, just
Wow.
after Hitler became chancellor, and managed to get away to Manchester in England, where they, you know, they already wanted him to come, and he didn't want to go because it wasn't as pretty as Germany. He went, and then when he got to Britain, he found Britain, this would have been like 1930s, that England was all enthralled with this idea, this communist idea of socialized science, so that the
Hmm.
government plans what scientists will discover. And Polanyi just thought that's ridiculous. You've got to have liberty.
Yeah.
So you have to have, kind of like a liberty of conscience for a scientist. And so that's what got him thinking about the foundations of science.
Okay.
And so a lot of my colleagues in the Polanyi Society would argue that his epistemological proposals really came in that context to combat this, heady idea of socialized science.
Wow,
So,
that's amazing. It's really cool to step back and see. It's really hard for him. He had to leave his mother country, being persecuted. That's horrible and awful. And even still, you see amazing stuff come from it because he was under this pressure because he was in a new environment where they're treating science in a bad way, that he was able to think differently and come up with new things.
yeah, yes, yep, yeah.
Yeah.
There was something else I was going to say. Oh, gee.
Philosophers, we got to turn to.
The other thing is the term philosophy of science. When I've taught a philosophy of science course with a philosophy of science book, like the standard story of philosophy of science, he's nowhere in there.
Okay.
And he didn't see himself as doing a philosophy of science.
Hmm.
What he saw himself doing was saving science. Because he thought, if you have this defective idea of what knowledge is, no scientific discovery could ever happen.
Right.
But it does. So you need a different epistemology that shows what actually goes on with discovery. And see, the point is, if you take knowledge to be explicit information, how do you make a discovery? I mean, it's the old Mano problem.
Yeah, Meno paradox. Yeah.
Right. So either you know it or you don't. If you know it, you don't need to discover it. If you don't know it, you can't begin. So it's that he felt, look, my job is discovery. And for discovery, I got to have freedom. And I've got to have the freedom to accredit unspecifiable hunches that I have to rely on because I don't have anything else. So really what the scientist and any learner, really, any discoverer need to do is scrabble subsidiarily with these clues and trust yourself to things that you only half understand. Yeah. It's very comforting, actually, to have this approach and be a student or a teacher.
Yeah.
I found it very freeing as both for my students and for myself.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah, and I that you've helped me understand why he went the way he went with his epistemology, and because of his concerns from science. You mentioned in one of them, I read both of them recently, so that both Contact with Reality and Loving to Know, so they're both
you need
jumbled.
A prize. Thank you so much. You can get a double prize.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hopefully the audience will jump in too, because and pick up these books because they're really great, and I've definitely benefited from reading them. But you mentioned that Polanyi, he says that we ought to focus not on explanation but on discovery, and then he brings that into epistemology, and he says that epistemology shouldn't focus just on the items of knowledge, the things that we already have. Don't spend all your time trying to account for knowledge that we already have by offering rational justification, but work on accounting for acts of coming to know, discoveries, coming to know. So I take it that that's where the tacit knowledge comes in. You mentioned these like unspecifiable hunches. That's tacit knowledge, right? That's like knowledge that it's not explicit. Is it implicit, or is tacit the right nomenclature to use there?
Well, tacit means silent, as opposed to explicit, which is verbalized.
Okay. Now,
Marjorie Green, who was the premier philosopher who really helped him with his work, and is an incredible commentator on him. She says what you got to get Polanyi is not tacit and explicit,
Okay.
but subsidiary and focal.
Yeah.
And in particular, you've got to see that any act of coming to know is a structure of subsidiary focal integration. So it's not like there's some kind of knowledge that's separated. It's
Yeah.
not like there's subsidiary knowledge over here and focal knowledge over here. No, it's this from to structure. So always you're relying on clues to focus on it or integrate to a pattern. And
Yeah.
when people say tacit and explicit knowledge, and they tend not to get that structure, and then they tend to think, okay, well, what Polanyi was saying is you can't manage to get all your knowledge to be explicit, so there's always going to be this tacit remainder.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean that's just, and the thing about subsidiary focal knowledge is the subsidiary you could articulate. It's just that you can't indwell it at the same time that you articulate it.
Huh.
So there's a formula for keeping your balance on a bike. But the 4-year-old doesn't know that.
Right.
I mean, his body knows it. His body lives it out.
Okay.
But so a good teacher, for example, or any teacher, a coach, a piano teacher. I mean, this so goes with sports and
Yeah.
music and artistry. What you have to do as a teacher is utter sentences that are more like maxims rather than information. Because a teacher, like a coach, has to utter a sentence that gets your body to do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So, and then you see, it's not, even if they do give you information, it's not your memorizing the information that's going to get you to the insight. You somehow you've got to climb into it subsidiarily. So
Okay.
when my father taught me to ride a bike, he put me on a bike and pushed me and he yelled balance. Did I say I was a skeptic? I mean, I'm going down that hill thinking, what does the word balance even mean and how would I even know?
Yeah.
But somehow I'm sure he was confident by the time I got to the bottom of the hill, I'd have figured it out.
My dad did the same thing with my sister. Yeah, same thing. When I went a hill and it took just one down and she had it and she knew how to ride a bike. He didn't do it with me. I didn't want that. So we did other methods, but so the subsidiary focal integration, that's from this point A to point B. That it kind of just clicked for me that's your 3 dimensions of knowing: the world, the lived body, and the directions in the normative world. I think I see how that fits more, where you have this lived body and that's you riding the bike, but you didn't know the normative formula for how someone should balance. I wonder where the world comes in. Is that like you on the bike and
Yeah, and actually, if I might ask you to read yet another book, Longing to Know has the most extended unfolding of subsidiary focal integration.
Okay.
With the by far more illustrations.
Okay.
It's like over the top.
That's great.
But in Longing to Know, that's where I start talking about 3 sectors of clues, and those are my Framian triad.
Yeah.
So that's my frame component. And so literally John Frame taught me to find if there's a situational and an existential, there's got to be a normative.
Yeah.
So, and what I say is those are 3 sectors of clues. So me trying to ride the bike, at the top of the hill, point A, nothing's working out for me. Like, so his yelling balance, that bike, I was sure nobody could keep balance on 2 points. I mean, that contraption was just opaque to me, and my body might as well have been, like we say, all thumbs. I mean, so even my own body, if I focus on it, which I was doing at the beginning, was meaningless. And everything was all disconnected.
Yeah.
So once you get to get going on the performance of keeping your balance on a bike, all those come together as clues and they kind of merge together with your body. So that when I taught my children to ride a bike, I yelled balance.
Did it work for them as well?
Eventually.
Great. That's awesome.
I don't remember too much, except I clearly can see one little girl, turning the handlebars too sharply and falling off, and I knew she was gonna do it. She was the one when I taught her to drive the car that the first thing she did in the high school parking lot was look at her foot on the accelerator pedal, and I about jumped out the window. So she was a little too heavy on the bodily focal.
Yeah. Yeah. That's hilarious because the triads are so deep in my brain. I've read most everything Frame has written, and it's just so deep. And even when I try not to see it, it pops up, and I go, all right, I'm missing a perspective here. Let's see.
Well, and you see, again, in Longing to Know, that book is me trying to justify my own Christianity to myself.
Okay.
And it's a book for people considering Christianity who have epistemic issues like I did. And so when I'm working with the Magic Eye 3D picture a lot in there, and John Frame set me looking for the normative. Well, it's the directions. So when you first come to a magic eye, you don't even know what it is, and you're maybe not even sure that it's a game. So you heavily rely on the directions, even though you can't understand them at that point.
Yeah.
So that I was trying to in order to justify my own Christianity to myself, it seemed to me that I needed to show that this crazy thing that Christians believe, that you read the Bible to find out about God, and that crazy thing is not somehow different from every other ordinary act of knowing.
Yeah.
And so that's how I got to it. So the clues and the directions, you've got the direction in the magic eye, and you can't even have knowing without authoritative guides. You can't.
Yeah.
One time I taught this at the seminary level, and there was a guy on a second career who was retired. Um, what would it be? X-15 fighter pilot.
Wow.
And he said, tell them, you're right. There's no way you can fly a fighter jet if you didn't have an authoritative guide. There's no way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that triad, it's so helpful, and I found it in your work. I've also found it in Kevin Van Hooser's work, who I studied with at TEDS, who is another student of Frame, and you even mentioned this word triangulating in Longing to in Loving to Know.
I invented it.
Yeah, yeah, and
it's not what it means.
Yeah, right. But the role of another person in coming to know something, and I found that in this philosopher Donald Davidson, and he's got a secular theory, and I think he accidentally makes an argument for God's existence from triangulating, from concept acquisition. You taught your daughter the concept of bike, by looking at her and triangulating with her with the word, and she formed the concept over time. But someone taught you, and someone taught your parent, and someone all the way back to infinite regress, or to a divine mind that started things, or to a process of emergence out of evolutionary theory or something. So I thought that was really cool, and everyone's kind of, you and Van Hooser and Frame and me taking this on as well, are all kind of like feeling around the same thing, that there's this need for norms, and there's also this need for another person to share those norms with you. I thought that was so cool, and it represents like God made us for other people. God made us for interaction with himself as well. There's an interpersonal dimension that you can't avoid.
I once wrote, and I've said this repeatedly, that being a mom or a parent of a very small child is the most philosophical job.
Yeah.
Because you're naming the world to the child, and the child doesn't even see the world until you start to name it.
Yeah, totally. That's totally right. Yeah, and like you're teaching them the concept of table, and then they can pick that out, and they realize table is not just that thing in the dining room, but it's also at McDonald's. It's also over here, and they're different shapes and colors. Yeah, it's really, really cool.
My daughters would call everything flying in the air that was mechanical, would call it I guess she called it an airplane. So And
Yeah.
we were living in South Louisiana at the time. There were a whole lot of helicopters. And one day I said to her, "Well, a helicopter goes wop, wop, wop." Well, she always had the distinction after that, you know?
Ah,
She could accurately
so cool. I love that. Yeah, it's so
helicopter
cool.
wop, wop, wop.
Yeah. Well, so that kind of brings me to something I really have been wanting to ask you about. You make this the statement that Polanyi's approach helped you at least make sense of presuppositionalism,
Mm,
and that the presuppositions are like tools,
mhm.
and it helps us in servant thinking. Can you help flesh that out a little bit more? How does Polanyi help us make sense of presuppositions and
That's good, and it was so key for me because I really met Frame's work and Polanyi's work about the same time,
mm,
and, you know, when I was and, you know, as I told you my story, I'm kind of coming into a reformational, particularly Van Tillian, uh, shaping of my Christianity at that point, and it presuppositionalism seemed to me to be a no-brainer. It just seemed that it's always seemed to me that, you know, you look at premises and a conclusion, and there's deeper premises.
yeah,
You know, and it's like the main act is way down. That's one of the reasons I felt like philosophy was so
hmm,
obvious that I had to do. But at the same time, you know, if some and lots this has been the approach of so many people to say, well, everybody's got a worldview, you know, and worldviews are, you know, fundamental belief commitments that shape everything about the way that you see the world. I've taught that myself at at Geneva.
hmm,
Um, but but that doesn't exactly help you adjudicate,
right,
you know, or figure out which ones you're supposed to take to be yours, you know?
right,
And I think, what I felt was to say that rendered brought into my faith an arbitrariness that was worse.
yeah,
And that arbitrariness was bothered me.
hmm,
Well, so then when I read that Polanyi said, "Well, a theoretical framework works like a tool," which
hmm,
means you subsidiarily indwell it. I think it's Tacit Dimension he says this in. Um, that made me realize why it feels arbitrary, because it is arbitrary, to temporarily revert to fixate on what you're supposed to indwell.
hmm, yeah, yeah.
So,
That's
in other
yeah,
words, what you as a Christian believer, you wanna wear the Bible.
hmm,
You know? Uh, if you memorize it, which you know, I think it's good to memorize, it's because you wanna memorize it so you wear it, so that then reality comes to you that way. But
hmm,
it's not so you can kinda have this, you know, you picked this information that's gonna be your kind of arbitrary starting point.
yeah,
That's so un comfortable as a religion, I guess. Does that make
yeah, yeah.
sense?
I think it does. It just does. Going back to the world, the live body, and the directions. So I would think of it as like the directions are the abstract. They don't have to be abstract, but it's the rules, it's the norms, and then the world will allow you to wear those presuppositions or not. So if you start with like a false set of presuppositions, the world's going to smack you in the face, and you're not going to be able to live those
Yeah.
accurately. Does that sound right?
I think so. There's, in longing to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know, maybe that's not the right place. There's this great quote from a documentary about New York City, and the guy was talking about the trash, and he was like a real, you know, kind of understated sort of guy, and I remember him saying, "Sooner or later, the trash will win." I guess it is in the chapter called "Getting It Wrong,"
Okay.
and that was actually one thing that really appealed to me about Polanyian epistemology, this subsidiary focal integration. Your subsidiaries, it's not like you've just baptized them as incorrigible.
Yeah.
You can indwell mistaken subsidiaries,
Hmm.
and you know, so you can and you can get that you can get them half right and get them half wrong. I actually think the defective epistemic default that I talk about in Loving to Know
Mm-hmm.
is mistaken subsidiaries. It's my body that learned Cartesianism and became an object.
Yeah.
And so it's my body that's got to unlearn it,
Hmm.
which is why I do epistemological therapy.
Yeah.
So somehow, subsidiaries, you can get them part right and get them part wrong. You can train them so you can become one of these bike riders that does these, mogul things.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or you can do the Tour de France or whatever. So it's trainable, and sometimes expert trainers and trainees have to go back to square one and retrain.
Yeah.
So, figure skaters talking about getting a new coach and it taking 2 years to relearn
Hmm.
some things. So I guess
Yeah.
I've lost the train of thought, so I'll let you bring me
Well,
back.
yeah, this is I'm so glad that you talk so much about physical aspects because I wrestled in college and that's what kind of struck me at first when I was reading your work because and gaining the idea of tacit knowledge and moving from point A to point B because there are some really good wrestlers out there who make terrible coaches. And sometimes some of them who they've never had to work with kids before when you see them, a lot of our coaches would make us work the kids club at the college too, just kind of a rotation. It's
Mhm.
good for us, but it's also good for the program for them to have free labor from us. But we're on scholarship anyways. So you see someone come through, they've been coached their whole life. They know how to wrestle really well, but you try to see them or you see them try to teach a child and they just can't do it. And there's like this mental break at first. And then after that, sometimes just the shock of it will make someone want to learn more. And then be
Hmm.
like, "Oh, I don't know how to teach this. And they become really good coaches after that.
Yeah.
Sometimes not, but
Yep. That's
yeah.
right. I worked with a baseball player. Well, no, I guess he was a baseball teacher who was a huge skeptic.
Hmm.
Uh, and like at the point that he became a believer, he was both called to ministry and his doubts just started to strangle him. So
Wow.
at the point that I met him, he was playing video games rather than doing his seminary homework.
Huh.
But I also learned about him that he charged $60 an hour to teach kids to bat.
Yep.
He said to me, "I'm a better teacher than George Brett."
Hmm.
And I said, "Oh." That sounds like confidence to me.
Yeah.
I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "Because I've read George Brett's book and he doesn't know what he himself is doing right."
Hmm. Wow.
To your point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it makes sense with to me and probably to a lot of my listeners, it makes sense when you get into like a really physical discipline like wrestling, like baseball, like any kind of sport. When it comes to just thinking, doing like philosophy in the armchair, I could see people being more skeptical of that and saying, "Well, what do you need your body for?" Not saying we are just a brain on a stick or anything like that, but when it comes to when it comes to doing philosophy in the armchair, how does the epistemological therapy how does that work?
Well, that's a fabulous question. Well, I would say to say, "What does my body matters?" is a profoundly philosophical claim.
Yeah.
So, uh, I perhaps one ought to use the armchair to start thinking about that one,
Yeah.
and then I think, uh, here's how one of the ways I've expressed it over my time as a teacher, and that is if I lecture, some people tend to say, "Oh, well, discussions are way more embodied or, interactive and boo lectures, yay discussions." Well,
Right.
what said is I wear my lecture. There's
Hmm.
that wearing idea. It's
Yeah.
like, and I literally am inviting my students into my body because it's only as you get into my body that you can figure out what I'm thinking.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
so that's one of the and I think that's important for philosophical writing too, but it's important for philosophical teaching.
Hmm.
And if you take the thesis of loving to know, the most important, and this isn't a component so much as the fabric of the whole thing
Yeah.
of knowing, is love.
Hmm.
So, get over some goofy idea of knowledge as information,
Yeah.
right? And see that it is your desire for the real.
Yeah.
And okay, yes, you can sit in your chair, me in my desk chair here, and long for the real, but that doesn't mean that longing is merely cerebral. And
Yeah.
actually, it's interesting. And any help you can give me in this would be welcome.
Sure.
But if you start like when I wrote Little Manual, which is kind of the little skinny alternative to Loving to Know, but so much is left out, obviously. But I also tried to start with love.
Hmm.
And I think to myself, I'm not sure Little Manual works that well because I think you've got to do Polanyi and subsidiary focal integration first before you start talking about love, because love is pedal language. You know what I mean with my daisy of dichotomies?
Yeah.
In Loving to Know, we think, yay, knowledge, boo, emotions,
Yep.
right?
Mhm.
And that means love has an epistemic gravitas to
Mhm.
it, So you have to dispel the daisy.
Yeah.
And I don't know a better way to do it than to teach somebody subsidiary focal integration and get them to think about riding their bike. And then they're ready for love to be something other than pedal language. But what it is, I mean, what Polanyi said about commitment in personal knowledge, he called it our manner of disposing ourselves toward the world. Well, that's love language.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I really like that. I wonder. I'm trying to think of like the most abstract thing, and it's probably either philosophy or like mathematics, like certain types of mathematics where it's just sheer armchair, sheer like equations. But even then, like you're doing that for a reason, and you're doing that because hopefully you're doing that because you want to get closer to reality. You want to get closer to truth, to what's going on, and the physicists are at your door hoping that you're coming up with something to help out their theories, because you do think that philosophy maps onto reality in an important way. So even in the most cerebral, abstract, there's still that love, and it's not the gushy, woo woo, weird love. It's yeah,
I
that's
think
really
it's
great.
a twinkle in the eye.
Okay,
I've told my students, you want to study with a teacher with a twinkle in their eye about, the human genome process and also about you, their student.
yeah. Well, yeah, okay, that's a good point. So with you find someone with a twinkle in the eye, and when you find someone like that, it's amazing because that's the person you want to study with, right? But d sometimes when you ask them, you're like, "Why? Why the genome?" Or "Why, biochemistry or something?" And, a lot of times they're like, "Because do you know what this is? If you know what this is, then you don't even have to ask me that." And it's like, "Okay, but there are other really
I
dry
don't know.
professors." Yeah, um, is the twinkle in the eye, I was bringing it back to, like, to tacit knowledge and stuff. Is that something that can be made explicit, you think? Or that type of loving your it's probably what God made you to do, and that's probably why you like it so much. But is that are you able to express that, you think?
Are you married?
Yeah.
Okay. So if I ask you why you love your wife, I bet you'd say a million things and still feel like you hadn't gotten to the heart of it.
Yeah. And even now, I'm hesitant because I have a lot of different, philosophy in my head too, and thinking like, if I say I love her for this reason, then I love her for that, and not for who she is. And but it's like it is
I
pretty
do.
inexplicable. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she better not put up with a list of items from
Right.
you.
Right. Because as soon as that list shrinks or something, it's like, what, do I love her less? Like, no, I better not.
No, actually, subsidiary focal integration helps here
Okay.
because do you know the well, that I'm not gonna say that.
Mm.
What you're doing like if you introduce me to your wife and you want me to know how awesome she is. I mean,
Yeah.
I do this with introducing any of my friends.
Mhm.
I start listing things that I think are amazingly cool about this person.
Yeah.
And what Polanyi helps us see is, well, what you're doing is you're offering clues that you're inviting somebody subsidiarily to indwell, and it's only as people indwell them some subsidiarily that the reality would start to come to be apprehended.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Okay.
the Bible's the same way. I
Mm.
mean, don't worship the Bible.
Hmm.
What it is what that is the kind of the authoritative what you indwell subsidiarily
Yeah.
in order to be kind of lined up
Yeah.
so that you can see him.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the breakdown in communication and subsidiary knowledge here, where if someone were describing my wife Julie in a way that's inadequate, or yeah, inadequate, let's say that, and someone else, the person who's getting the description, comes to dislike my wife because they don't like the description. Um, What is there a word for that type of breakdown where they're not able to like embody the description of my wife as she really is, as she is in reality, because the description is not accurate. It's like a faulty bridge. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm sort of halfway tracking. Can you
Well,
say
so when yeah, so when you said you invite people to like into your body when you give a lecture, a
yeah.
philosophy lecture. If you were sick one day and you weren't quite up to the task, and your brain was all foggy and stuff,
Mhm.
it seems like there'd be like static in the communication. They
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to indwell in the way that you need them to because of the faulty communication. Does Polanyi does he deal with like that kind of breakdown in communication and you know, indwelling, or does that have more to do with your advancement of him? And then if so, what do you make of that?
That's a good question. I probably ought to go back and reread everything that Polanyi said again.
Hmm.
Uh, there's some amazing things in personal knowledge, as you've noted.
Mhm.
But one thing I argue in Longing to Know, and this would be me,
Mhm.
hopefully being true to Polanyi,
Okay.
um, is oh, maybe it's not in Longing to Know. Well, I don't know. I can
Yeah.
think of different conversations or passages, but the nice thing about subsidiary focal integration from a teacher's point of view, this is like very forgiving. It is there is no necessary minimal set of subsidiaries.
Okay.
It's not like you have an exact, you've got to have these 10.
Uh-huh.
It could be that you have a cluster of them and whatever cluster you have, you really do rely on the student to climb into them uh because for the reason of the wrestlers who can't teach about wrestling, you do rely on the student to get on board.
Right.
You just can't ride the bike for the kid.
Yeah.
So, but you can be flawed as a teacher. And that this is has been my comfort for years because I always stumble over my words. I am hardly an expert on anything.
Hmm.
But you know what I've got? I could bottle excitement and sell it.
Love that.
I'm a very excitable person.
Hmm.
And so I feel like the excitement has helped my students say, okay, gonna do it. And jump in. And
Yeah.
so all my classes, like I've read books that are too hard for me with my students. And I've said, here's the deep end. Jump in, and so my whole performance has been flawed.
Mhm.
But somehow it's some things have come out. Now, can I have misled some people? Absolutely. And as you can imagine, let's just switch over and talk about John Frame.
Mhm.
A lot of people got it wrong when he started talking about the normative. They took him to be not orthodox.
Yeah.
It's another reason to be in philosophy, really. Because
Not as much at stake. Yeah.
there's some cruelty that goes on in the name of exactitude.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that would be an example
Okay.
of something that was a stumbling block, but I don't think that was Frame's fault.
Yeah.
I think but that was just like a real hang up for certain people.
Yeah.
You
So
know, Does
we've talked. Well, yeah, that helps. So you can be flawed as a teacher, and you can make up for it with various other aspects to still welcome people in. Can you be flawed as a student? I can imagine, because there's so much attitude, there's so much that it's important in the covenantal epistemology. If you were super reluctant, just just dragging your heels, unwilling to be a good student, I get that. That one makes sense. How about like cognitive limitations and such?
Well, one I've thought about a lot is abuse.
Mm,
You know, there's so many young students who have had to struggle with abuse because that's part of the legacy of modernity is, abuse of control.
yeah,
Of course, it's also the legacy of sin.
yeah.
But, people show up as 18-year-olds in a class. I remember once, I can't remember her name, but she was in my logic class, and I used the last unit on philosophical awareness. I had them read Little Manual for Knowing, where I actually do mention if you've been in an abusive situation, you are in no way ready for a knowing venture.
Hmm,
That doesn't start out with you taking care of the abusive thing, getting
yeah.
over the abuse. And she came unglued. She couldn't finish the course
Wow.
because that was so true of her.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah.
That's not quite what you're asking, but anyway, I think it's to the point of something that you said there.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think so. It's not just on the teacher side, and it's not just on the student side, and there can
The
be.
other thing is it takes time. So in recent years, I've been trying to learn what I never got taught, which is classical Christian metaphysics.
Mhm.
And I don't feel like I've learned it until I can indwell it as my own. And it's taking years.
Hmm.
I think if I'd gotten it starting in the cradle,
Yeah.
but I have read and reread the same books and the same passages. And it's just trying to, first I got to get to the place where I can say what somebody says.
Yeah.
But it's yet another thing to get to the place where I can feel like I've indwelled it.
Do you think that it's difficult to learn classical Christian metaphysics because, the way you've been taught has led you to indwell a different metaphysic that is you have to unlearn? Or is it because, um, it's been so long since you've had to think about those type of things? Do you know what I'm saying? Are you already in a different location, or is it you're more, starting out, I guess?
I think I'm starting out, but partly because I've spent my whole life on the epistemological
Sure.
questions.
Sure.
Remember, one of your first questions was why epistemology?
Yeah.
Well, there was no other thing for a modern, a philosophically attuned person in modernity because epistemology is all you're allowed to do.
Right.
You're not allowed to do metaphysics.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
So I had to earn the right by at least responsibly addressing my own epistemological questions,
Mhm.
which I did in those 4 books. So, Longing to Know, Loving to Know, Little Manual, and finally Contact with Reality is my old dissertation updated. Um, but I finally feel now that I have done that well enough that I don't have to be stuck in the epistemological
Hmm.
question, and I can think about the real.
Wow.
And the amazing segue for me is, starting in 2014, starting to read, in particular, DC Schindler,
Hmm.
and realizing that his work was profoundly resonating with with my own covenant epistemology.
Huh.
And so I felt like I had taken the test and gotten an A,
Yeah.
and now somebody was giving me the textbook,
Yeah, that's awesome.
which
Yeah.
feels like, the heavens opened.
Yeah.
But I've gotta and, to get to the point where I can write that for ordinary people, which is what I always feel is my shtick to
Mhm.
do, is a trick.
Yeah.
I'm trying, but that's kinda why it's been so hard for me recently to write.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I wanted to jump back before we let you into graduate onto metaphysics. Stick just a little bit more on epistemology. Um, I'm really fascinated and interested by Polanyi's the role he gives to intuition, and you make this comparison a little bit with Peirce's abduction, and I'm just not clear, and I don't think I read that part
Yeah, if I did that,
clearly.
it's because somebody made me do it. I
Okay,
can't remember anything about Peirce, but
okay,
my Polanyi colleague, Phil Mullins, is the Peirce guy. You
okay,
you'd have to go after him.
okay. Well, how about just like the role of intuition in moving from point A to point B in these subsidiaries. What what is intuition doing for us?
Yeah, that's good. Well, you have to always whoever you're talking to, you gotta define what
Right.
intuition is. So and, Polanyi has an essay called "The Creative Imagination,"
Mm,
where he distinguishes between intuition and imagination. And so, if you're on the track of a discovery,
hmm.
a knowing venture, you have a sense of the half hidden pattern that you're moving toward.
Okay.
That would be intuition. Now, what imagination would be the creative subsidiary scrabbling or ransacking that you do subsidiarily to try to make it to the goal. And you navigate because you have this what he called this sense of increasing proximity to the solution.
Yeah.
So you can actually have a sense that you're getting closer to it. That's intuition.
Yeah. I It's so hard because I know that's true. I've had that situation before. And I think usually in math class, because I'm like so desperate because I wasn't very good at math, but I knew there's something here if I just stick with it. And that's where it's burned in my head because of all the stress. But w- how is it that we have those kind of it's like a magical gift that we could I'm on the trail. I'm on it. And some people have different gifts for different, they're crime solvers and they're on the scent of
Yeah.
the
Yeah, you do calling in
yeah.
terms of what people's loves are and what they see that other people don't see, and oh, yeah.
Yeah. Is
Yeah.
that it's kind of the nature and nurture question, I guess, but is it like did you this is maybe just opinion, but do you think God wired us for different things? And that's
Yes.
why they come intuitively? Or do you think can I grow to make myself love something I don't love?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
And there you wanna follow your authoritative guide. So,
Mm,
in your life, there's maybe 2 or 3 people that you should accredit that actually know you better than you do.
interesting.
And they might say and actually, if you can think of yourself back as a 16-year-old,
Yeah.
you might there might have been a wrestling coach who knew about you something that you didn't know about yourself,
Yeah.
and you would do well to follow his guidance. And, when you go off to college, the whole reason for a core curriculum is that some people wiser than you think you need this.
Mhm.
And so you're submitting to authoritative guides. You're not getting those things out of the way. I always corrected everybody's lingo.
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, but they're part of your humanness. And so I really think the job of colleges is to cultivate lovers of the real.
Mhm.
So and I would like to add, because now I'm talking about a metaphysics of childhood.
Hmm.
What we need to do is not uncultivate the love the children are born with.
Yeah. I hear that a lot from philosophers, which it always makes me appreciate it. But people, a lot of philosophers will say, "I had this question about my highlighter, and what if my highlighter, yellow, is actually your purple?" And they just stuck with it. And a lot of us think of that when we're kids, but it gets beaten out of us, or it gets smashed out of us, or it's not going to make us a bunch of money, so we drop that. But I think what you're saying is totally right there. Like let the little philosophers continue to be philosophers and give them training
Yes.
and encouragement along the way to that this is a noble pursuit, that this is good, that this will get you closer to reality, and that's actually worthwhile.
Well, and I would say it is the thing we're made for. We are made to be lovers of the real.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
born lovers of the real. We're called to it. We're made to it. That's communion with the real is what we're made for.
Yeah.
And that's what makes us happy.
Yeah.
So
I
all
want
these years, I mean, why was my skeptical problem a real problem? Because I was made to love the real.
Yeah.
And I couldn't trust the real. And I think modernity is laced with distrust of the real, which is what, and you can add in there the word acedia. You know what that means? Acedia. So it's one of the 7 deadly sins. And Joseph Pieper, philosopher, defines it as refusal to consent to being. And so, really, every human being lives out a yes or a no.
Uh-huh.
The Joker in Batman, that's a no.
Yeah.
Right? Willed loneliness. But you have to posture a consent to the real. But modernity, arguably, is one big no to the real.
Yeah.
So it's like endemically a rejection of the real. It's an anti-realist.
Yeah.
So no wonder I had the problems I did. I mean, there's something appalling about a 13-year-old being a skeptic. And it's kind of interesting. I've thought about this too. It wasn't till I was 13 that I was a skeptic. So, presumably there was a childhood of loving the real before I started to have those questions.
Yeah. And then you snapped into a different place where now you don't know if you can trust.
Which you might blame on modernist, epistemologically tainted educational practices.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. I want to anticipate one potential modernist objection from the audience, where if Polanyi and you following him are saying, we talked about this at the beginning, but epistemology should focus not on accounting for knowledge that we already have, but and coming to know. We need to focus on that. So I can imagine a situation where someone says, I picked these lottery numbers because I had this intuition that they were going to be right. And I can't explain how I knew it, but I knew it. And then tomorrow it comes true and I did win the lottery. I think most epistemologists are following, especially justified true belief, and we're going to say, look, that's like a Gettier case or something. You weren't actually justified in that. Yes, it was a true belief, but it didn't count as knowledge because you weren't justified in that. But if they abuse Polanyi's system and say it's an intuition, and I want to talk about how I came to know that instead of trying to justify that I knew it. Oh, what do you make of that? Is that a problem?
Well, Polanyi would say anybody that reasons that way doesn't come near a science lab.
Yeah. Okay.
You want to be a scientist, you got to do better than that.
Yeah.
For one thing, you got to entrust yourself to science as a vision of reality. That was one thing he said. But then you got to have years and years of training. There's a great paragraph, and I guess it's in Tacit to mention, where he says, this verification thing, nobody would ever let you in a lab. And if they did let you in the lab, you'd break the instruments. And if you managed not to break the instrument, you wouldn't know how to work it. And if you could figure out how to work it and you got some data, nobody would believe it.
Yeah. That's so good. Yeah, so it's trusting science, but it's not trusting the verificationist, the
Right.
logical positivist
That's right.
conception or bastardization of science.
And because the thing is, in the moment of discovery, how you've made contact with discovery is not confirmation, it's hope of confirmation. So, it's your unspecifiable sense that there are indeterminate future possibilities. There is inarticulability all over that. And, after that, you might spend the whole rest of your years trying to confirm it. But in the moment of discovery, all you have is that unspecifiable sense, possibilities. My favorite old movie, Hunt for Red October. Are you familiar with it?
I am. I was a child when I saw it, so
Okay.
I can't
Well,
go into yeah.
there's the holy shit moment, pardon my where he realizes that Ramius is not trying to start World War III. He's trying to defect and bring the submarine with him.
Okay.
Well, that's maybe 30 minutes into the film. The whole rest of the film is his trying to prove that that's right.
Okay.
But the moment of discovery, which happens in the briefing room when he's supposed to be briefing all these guys that think World War III is getting started.
Yeah. It's really fascinating, and it's really this whole model that you've developed in Polanyi. It is a bit of a paradigm shift, though that's some loaded language from Kuhn, but it's a different way of thinking, and it's a really good way. And I think that it is challenging if you've been inoculated so deeply by modernity. But I think that it is representative of philosophy as it used to be done in the schools, following Plato, following Aristotle. I don't think that it was all just a popular level philosophy because, like Plato said, if you don't know geometry, you can't even enter into my thing. So it was high level, but it also was a way of being. They dressed the same. You could see the philosophers. You knew their haircut. You knew the togas they wore. Like it was
What
this way of being.
Were like.
Yeah, I wonder too. That's fantastic. So I appreciate what you've done, and I appreciate you also, following Polanyi and swimming against the stream, I guess, swimming in a different way, and just being confident enough to say, look, I'm going to run with this. I'm going to show my work along the way, but I don't care if this is different. I want it to be.
Well, it's the trump card because you can't help but do it. There is no other way to ride a bike.
Yeah.
I'm from Pittsburgh. We've been in love with Ben Roethlisberger, the quarterback who is now, going to the happy hunting ground. But, explicit knowledge is Ben Roethlisberger standing on the 50-yard line reading the playbook. That's not what we paid him to do.
Right.
What you see in every football game is subsidiary focal integration.
Yeah.
And he was an artiste.
Yeah. Yeah. Throwing a football is a really good one. Throwing a baseball, throwing those. It's amazing.
Anything, any field.
Yeah.
Any field.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Dr. Meek, this has been so fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the books as well. I need to jump in on Longing to Know, I think, and dive in a little bit deeper. For the audience, one more time, the books that we were discussing today were Loving to Know. It's a covenantal epistemology. Contact with Reality, which is Dr. Meek's dissertation, the first half, I think, and then updated the rest, and the whole thing's been updated. And then we mentioned Tacit Knowledge by Polanyi. I have this Knowing and Being. I haven't jumped in on this one yet.
Knowing and Being are his essays collected by Marjorie Green, and that critical introduction of hers, 3 or so pages, expert.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to jump in on that. And then a really big one. I haven't jumped in on The Study of Man yet, but I heard it's really good. And Personal Knowledge is like the big one that I've tried a few times. I was a little bit scared. I had to read your works first so I can kind of have an understanding, at least some hooks to hang stuff on.
It's a lot beyond me, but hey, that never stopped me. It's a good thing because I wouldn't have gotten anywhere. Let me also mention a couple other things. One is there's a Polanyi Society that anybody's welcome to in Polanyyan convivial style. Yeah. And there's resources there, Polanyi's, some of his essays and lectures and stuff. And then also my website is Esther Meek. And I try to keep that updated. You can subscribe for my monthly newsletter or whatever podcast like this.
Yeah.
When you send me the link, I'll post it there. That kind of thing. So
okay, fantastic. And I'll put a link to your website in the description, so folks, you can find that right here wherever you're getting this podcast at. Dr. Meek, thanks so much for all your time, for all your work, for helping me think through this. Yeah, it's been awesome. Folks, that's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.